Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into some really profound forces. Forces that have, well, they fundamentally altered our sense of political time and how we even think about democracy.
We're using Timothy Snyder's incredibly detailed book, The Road to Unfreedom, as our guide.
And what we're looking at is a truly seismic shift.
It really is. Snyder argues that this bedrock assumption of the post-Cold War era, this comfortable, maybe even lazy, optimistic idea of automatic progress, he calls it the politics of inevitability, has essentially collapsed.
Right. We just sort of assumed that history was over, that things would just get better on their own.
That narrative was deeply ingrained, wasn't it? It was this idea that, if we just stay out of the way, the market will deliver democracy, democracy will bring prosperity, and all we have to do is just wait.
And that comfortable idea has been, well, dramatically and, in many ways, violently superseded in the last decade or so.
And what rushed in to fill that vacuum is what Snyder calls the politics of eternity.
And that concept is absolutely central to understanding so much of the instability we're seeing now, that feeling of anxiety that so many people feel.
So what is it? What is the politics of eternity?
It's a space where forward-looking policies, actual plans for the future, or even just basic political responsibility are effectively pushed aside.
Pushed aside for what?
For cycles of manufactured crisis, for the constant invocation of external threats and these powerful repeating myths of national victimhood. Time stops being this line moving forward.
It becomes a circle.
Exactly. A repeating circle of danger and innocence.
So our mission in this deep dive is to step back from that daily cycle of outrage, whether it's directed at foreign adversaries or domestic opponents, and instead analyze how these systems of power and narrative and perception actually operate.
We're looking at the mechanics of unfreedom itself. We're following the, frankly, uncomfortable connection Snyder draws from the ideological heart of modern Russia, watching them spread through Europe and then ultimately into the domestic politics of the United States.
And we really have to emphasize this. Our analysis is about the system. It's about defining these powerful ideas, inevitability and eternity, as historical concepts.
We aren't here to assign partisan blame. We're here to understand the structure of the collapse.
Okay, so let's unpack this by getting some context on the book and the author. Timothy Snyder is a historian of Europe and authoritarianism. He's known for his incredibly meticulous work on 20th century mass murders, specifically in the lands between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.
Yes, his book Bloodlands is famous for that. And that background is absolutely crucial here.
Why is that?
Because Snyder comes to this modern topic with a profound understanding of how fascist and totalitarian ideologies actually function. He gets the manipulation of historical facts, the justification of violence. He knows how these systems are built on narrative control.
Right, so he has the historical depth, and that really shapes the timing of The Road to Unfreedom. This wasn't some book written in an academic bubble.
Not at all. It was a direct response to what was happening in the world, specifically after Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014.
It was addressing these really worrying trends that were just exploding at that time. Democratic backsliding, information warfare becoming institutionalized.
And the visible erosion of a shared factual reality across the entire Western world.
The book is about systems under pressure, and Snyder sets up this whole idea of a changing sense of time, using this one very personal anecdote. It's really the anchor for his whole argument.
He starts by reflecting on two events that happened at almost the exact same time in 2010. The first one was the birth of his son in Vienna.
And he describes that experience as a perfect example of the European politics of inevitability. The sense that everything just worked. The transit was quick and efficient. The healthcare was high quality and covered. The public services were just there, reliable.
It was a quiet, competent future delivered. The calm assurance of linear progress.
But then you contrast that with this political catastrophe that happened almost simultaneously in April 2010, the Smolensk plane crash in Poland.
The plane was carrying the Polish president and dozens of top political and military leaders. They were on their way to Russia to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre.
And for anyone who doesn't know, Katyn was where the Soviet secret police murdered over 20,000 Polish officers and elites back in 1940, a tragedy that Russia denied for decades.
So you have this moment. Polish leaders are flying to commemorate a known, factual, historical atrocity committed by a neighbor.
But what happened in Poland right after the crash is a perfect illustration of the shift Snyder's talking about.
The initial national grief and unity, It just evaporated. It was almost immediately replaced by these pervasive, highly politicized rumors.
Rumors of a Russian conspiracy. Or even worse, that the Polish government was somehow complicit in the disaster.
And this is where that time distortion really kicks in. The obsession with the Smolensk conspiracy grew into this huge cultural and political force. And eventually, it completely crowded out the actual historical tragedy cotton that the victims were flying to commemorate in the first place.
So a verifiable fact from the past
Discarding
was replaced by a consuming political fiction in the present.
the Smolensk conspiracy.
Mm.
And that's the hook. That's the core thesis. The political world has shifted from anticipating progress to just repeating a story of eternal victimhood.
So let's just state that central thesis one more time really clearly. The politics of inevitability is the belief that the future is just an automatic, better version of the present.
While the politics of eternity is where you abandon any real plans for the future and replace them with these cyclical myths of victimhood.
And in that politics of eternity, the nation is always at the center of this tragic, repeating story where threats from the past just keep coming back.
And when you feel like progress is gone and doom is on the horizon, political responsibility just vanishes. Because if the enemy is always coming and the nation is always an innocent victim, then what you do in the present, it doesn't really make a difference.
You're only required to contemplate your own innocence.
Exactly.
Now let's get into the core mechanics of this. These two different timescapes that have governed recent history. Let's start with the one we left behind. The politics of inevitability, or P of I. At its root, it sounds almost like a surrender of political action.
It is, functionally, a surrender. P of I is defined by this core, and I think dangerous, belief that there are no ideas or no alternatives to the system we have.
Because progress is guaranteed by what?
By known laws.
Right. Whether you think they're economic laws or historical laws, the result is the same. Individual political action, responsibility, deep thought. They all become unnecessary distractions. Why bother debating policy if the right outcome is already baked in? And Snyder breaks this down into different regional versions. In the American capitalist version of P of I, the mantra was simple, and it was very seductive.
Nature brings the market brings democracy brings happiness.
A self-regulating, frictionless path to utopia.
But that narrative, as powerful as it was, stubbornly resisted the facts. You saw it after the Iraq War in 2003, which was supposed to automatically create a democracy.
And it absolutely did not.
And then even more dramatically after the financial crisis in 2008, even in the face of this massive systemic failure, the story just kept being told.
Yeah.
That even these deep wounds would eventually, sort themselves out for the better. No fundamental reform was needed.
The European version was a bit different. It was centered more on historical learning.
The idea that history brought the nation state, which then learned from its horrible wars that peace was good, and that led inevitably to continental integration, reliable social services, lasting prosperity.
Like the efficient hospital and subway in Vienna that Snyder observed.
Exactly. But this sense of automatic progress had these deeply corrosive consequences. Snyder shows it led directly to the hollowing out of democracy.
How so?
Because if the future is guaranteed, leaders become less concerned with long-term expensive social policy, things like guaranteeing pensions or health care, and they become more concerned with immediate wealth and influence.
You see this so clearly in the deregulation of campaign contributions in 2010. It just magnified the power of money over actual policy.
And this created massive economic inequality. When the state stops providing those basic social goods, under the assumption that prosperity will just keep happening on its own, the whole system becomes incredibly vulnerable.
The inevitability myth was like a slow leak, draining the crucial pillars of democratic stability.
And when economic inequality gets to a certain point, belief in progress just stops. For the majority of people, the future no longer holds a better, achievable version of the present. And that economic collapse is the precondition for the next timescape to rush in.
The politics of eternity. So if P of I was about looking forward automatically, P of E is about looking backward eternally. Its definition is that the nation is at the center of a cyclical victim story, where past threats just keep returning.
Time is a circle, not a line. And the propaganda is totally different. P of I tries to spin facts into a web of well-being, hiding problems with optimistic language.
The P of E is post-factual.
Completely. It suppresses facts entirely to dismiss the inconvenient reality that people are often freer, richer, and healthier in other places. So reform based on knowledge becomes impossible. the focus shifts entirely to contemplating this invisible national innocence rather than looking at observable, flawed reality.
And this transition is inextricably linked to the rise of oligarchy.
Right. The wealthy elites who benefited from the collapse of the prior system need a way to maintain control without ever having to enact reforms that might threaten their wealth.
So they offer what Snyder calls fake protection to people with real pain.
A very powerful phrase. By invoking myth and manufacturing crisis, a permanent external enemy, the oligarch can cross from the world of just accumulating wealth into the world of real nationalistic politics.
And this is where we have to anchor the ideology of the politics of eternity in the Russian context. Which brings us to Ivan Ilyin.
The chilling foundational blueprint. Ilyin was a 20th century Russian fascist philosopher. He died in 1954, but his work gained this immense official influence as the post-Soviet politics of inevitability crumbled in Russia.
He's not just an inspiration, is he?
No, he is the philosopher of eternity for the contemporary Russian state. His core concepts define their entire worldview.
What are they?
First, he insisted that Russia is an eternally innocent organism of nature and the soul, a nation with no original sin, and this innocence is proven by the repeating cycles of external threat.
So every single battle Russia ever fought was purely defensive.
According to Ilyin, yes, Russia is always the victim of an attack or a continental blockade by Europe. This means facts don't matter and political responsibility vanishes.
And crucially for today, Ilyin explicitly denied the separate existence of Ukrainians. He even put the word Ukrainians in quotation marks.
To him, speaking of Ukraine as a separate state was to be a mortal enemy of Russia. Ukraine was just an inseparable part of the Russian organism. You can draw a straight line from that idea to the 2014 invasion.
And second, and this is where the system's lack of freedom really gets codified, Ilyin fundamentally rejected the rule of law.
He embraced something called proizvol, which means arbitrariness. He argued that true law wasn't a system of rights and obligations, but the complete suppression of individual reason in favor of total national submission to an arbitrary leader.
The Redeemer.
The Redeemer. A fantastical figure of eternal innocence whose personal whim becomes law. This system creates what's called bespredal, literally, boundarylessness, the absence of limits.
If the state operates on the leader's whim, then officials are immune from prosecution, property rights don't exist, and citizens live in constant fear.
And because the Redeemer is a mythic, eternal figure, Ilyin offered no earthly idea of how the state could continue through legal or democratic succession. The system must be eternal to prevent its collapse when the leader is gone.
You can see this whole ideological path in the Russian case study. Early Bolshevism was definitely a politics of inevitability, right? Building socialism, looking toward a world revolution.
But that vision failed. The Soviet shift really began with Stalinism. The mass carnage of the 1930s, the famines, the purges, you couldn't justify that with the promise of some distant utopia that never arrived.
So the justification had to be retroactive. The suffering was necessary for the victory in World War II.
And that was the beginning of the end for Soviet inevitability. Leonid Brezhnev solidified the politics of eternity in the 1970s. Utopia never came, so nostalgia and a cult of the past had to fill the void.
He replaced the promise of a perfect future with the cult of the Great Fatherland War.
Soviet citizens were told to look backward, to define the West not as a system to be surpassed, but as a perpetual eternal threat, the source of the invasion in 1941.
Which meant sacrificing historical facts, like making it taboo to even mention the Stalin-Hitler alliance that started the war in '39.
The big military parades were meant to show that the Soviet Union was unchanging, eternal, and could not be reformed.
Fast forward to the 2000s and Vladimir Putin's adoption of this POV. His return to the presidency in 2012, after those fraudulent elections, really cemented it as the governing philosophy.
Since democratic succession was off the table, the political present had to become eternal, and that requires endless crisis and permanent threats.
So when Russians protested those faked elections in 2011 and 2012, the Kremlin's immediate reaction was to associate their demands for democracy with global sodomy.
A decadent foreign sexual perversion. And this is a perfect example of how the system works. It transforms a political critique of the rule of law, the demand for fair elections, into a moral panic.
A nebulous threat against the innocent national organism.
So voting becomes synonymous with the West, and the West becomes synonymous with sexual perversion. And this allows the state to reframe accountability as an existential, civilizational war.
And the choice of the West as the enemy was key, because at that moment, the West posed no real military threat.
The EU had no army, the US was drawing down its forces in Europe. The West was chosen as an enemy, precisely because Russian elections were faked, and only a fabricated eternal threat could justify dissolving the rule of law at home.
We've laid out the philosophy, but how did these ideas actually become a governing structure? Snyder doesn't just describe a philosophy, he maps out the whole architecture of Unfreedom.
He does. He details the key actors and the incentives that keep the politics of eternity running.
Starting with the actors. At the center, you have the political elite, or as Ilian called him, the Redeemer.
The Redeemer, the leader, is the figure whose persona merges with the state itself. He's the one who offers that eternal, virginal innocence to the nation.
And because the system relies on kleptocracy, on selling natural resources, the Redeemer can't actually reform the state.
He can only control it. He transforms it to match Ilian's proposals, where freedom really means subordination to his arbitrary will. He's the only one who can define reality.
Then you have the oligarchs. These are the wealthy elites who are the financial beneficiaries of this kleptocracy and the primary funders of the eternity narrative.
And we're not talking about successful entrepreneurs here. We're talking about figures whose wealth is completely tied to state control and corruption.
Like Konstantin Malafiev, the Orthodox oligarch.
A perfect example.
Mhm.
He funds the eternity narrative by being an outspoken anti-sodomy activist and an imperialist. He's on record saying, Europe had to be kept away from Ukraine because Ukrainians would have had to spread sodomy as a norm.
So he's converting his material self-interest, protecting his wealth, into a moral, civilizational struggle.
That is the very definition of POV.
And then you need the ideological engines, the intellectual hubs that create the vocabulary for this. You mentioned the Izborsk Club.
Right. Established in 2012. If Ilian provided the blueprint, the Izborsk Club provides the day-to-day talking points. It's the epicenter of this new Russian nationalism.
What do they actually say?
Their manifesto is stunningly explicit. They claim that factual reality and liberal institutions like academia and media are a lethal, ideological, and informational machine designed to destroy Russia's Eurasian space.
So they see historians and social scientists as weapons.
As weapons that disintegrate the unified state, so they replace linear history with this cyclical pattern of resurrected empires. Kiev Novgorod becomes Muscovy, becomes the Romanovs, becomes the Soviets, becomes Eurasia. It always rises from the dead.
Which gives the current regime a kind of historical inevitability, but in reverse.
It's always been this way, and it always will be. And this framework justifies the system's fourth set of actors, foreign governments and proxies.
This is where we see the recruitment of prominent European leaders, people like the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder,
Who went directly to work for the state-owned gas giant Gazprom, or Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, or Miloš Zeman in the Czech Republic, whose campaign was partly financed by Russian companies.
And these figures advocate for Russian interests, and fundamentally they advocate for European disintegration.
Right. Moscow supported far-right parties all across Europe. Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage, the AfD in Germany, using them as part of a strategy to destroy the EU from within by pushing for a return to some non-existent mythical past of the nation-state. The goal is chaos and separation.
So why? What are the core incentives driving all of this?
Since the state can't reform itself because of the kleptocracy and its dependence on commodity exports, foreign policy, often packaged as cultural or civilizational diplomacy, has to take the place of actual domestic policy.
And the core incentive for the oligarchy and the Redeemer is power consolidation through something called strategic relativism.
Exactly. Since Russian state power can't really grow its economy and tech lag way behind the West, the goal shifts. You can gain relative power by simply weakening others.
It becomes a negative-sum game. The goal isn't to win, it's to make sure your rivals lose more than you do.
Which is the motivation behind the strategy of exporting chaos. Putin presented this idea of Eurasia as an instrument to dissolve the EU. The objective is to simplify the world order back to a competition between great empires.
Let's talk about the specific narratives used to generate this chaos. First, the civilization state myth.
In 2012, Putin declared Russia an inherently innocent civilization, a producer and exporter of harmony. This myth is the justification for intervening anywhere while bypassing international law.
Because if Russia is a unique civilization, it has the right to speak for anyone it considers part of that civilization, regardless of borders.
Which is why Putin refuses to speak of a Ukrainian state. He prefers to imagine Ukrainians as just a folk scattered across Russian territory. Recognizing Ukraine becomes a challenge to Russian civilization itself.
The second narrative tool is weaponizing sexuality.
Using human sexuality as, quote, inexhaustible raw material for the manufacture of anxiety.
The anti-gay laws in 2013 formalized this. It associated democracy and the rule of law, anything Western, with these nebulous threats. Sexual decadence, sodomy.
So the narrative becomes demands for accountability equal the West, which equals sodomy. It transforms a political demand into a moral panic.
And finally, there's the deployment of history as ammunition.
Taking historical myths and using them to create new rights, overriding existing treaties and laws. The perfect example is the revival of Novorossiya, or New Russia.
That 18th century imperial territory.
An obscure term most Russians had never even heard of. But Putin used it in 2014 to justify seizing Ukrainian territory. By invoking this term, he set aside the mundane facts of the present and shifted the conversation to ancient rights, justifying military action to sever Ukraine from the Black Sea.
This whole system sustains itself through these powerful cyclical feedback loops. The first one you mentioned is the unreality of war.
If the system is built on fiction, then even war has to become a form of fiction. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the information war was led by political technologists, specialists in political fiction,
The real war was immediately accompanied by massive cyber campaigns.
aimed at confusing everyone. And Western media, when confronted with these exuberant denials of the obvious, like Russian troops being in Ukraine, were often seduced into just chasing phantom claims. A real bloody conflict becomes, in effect, reality television, with Putin as the hero.
Which leads directly to implausible deniability. The Russian media doesn't just deny facts, it provides contradictory, impossible accounts.
Like after the MH17 disaster, the passenger jet shot down over Ukraine. Russian TV created all these fictional versions that couldn't possibly coexist. The plane was shot down by a MiG and a Su-25 and from the ground by accident, and it was an assassination attempt on Putin.
The goal isn't to convince you of a single alternative truth.
No. The goal is to destroy the very idea of truth. When the foreign minister, Lavrov, denied the Russian troop presence, he didn't mean the facts were wrong. He meant that factuality itself was the enemy, and information technology deployed by the West.
And the most potent feedback loop is what Snyder calls schizofascism in practice.
This stunning cognitive dissonance where actual fascists deploy fascist ideology while branding their opponents as fascists.
And we see concrete examples. Russian officers in Ukraine painting slogans like "For Stalin" and "Death to Fascism" on their tanks.
It's the ultimate merging of extremes. Since Russia is defined as eternally innocent and a victim, no Russian can ever be a fascist. Therefore, the opponents, Ukrainians resisting an invasion, they must be the fascists, even if the Russian actions are based on fascist geopolitics.
The internal contradiction fuels the external war.
And it's easy to look at that as just an isolated foreign problem. But Snyder's most powerful point is drawing these lines back to the implications in Western democracies. The fundamental question is, how did the West become so vulnerable to this exported chaos?
And a lot of it seems to stem from technology and the erosion of a shared factual reality.
Right. Technology, especially the unregulated internet and social media, no longer just enhances American society. Snyder suggests it provides a better look inside American minds, allowing for the invisible manipulation of personalities on a massive scale.
He compares the internet to the manipulative suitor in a Stephen King story.
I know what you need. It knows so much about us, but interacts without revealing that fact, without any accountability. It makes citizens unfree by feeding their worst tribal impulses, their susceptibilities, replacing reflection with immediate gratification and outrage.
This is a direct assault on what you need for freedom. Freedom depends on citizens being able to distinguish between what's factually true and what they simply want to hear.
If you're only fed what you want, you become predictable. And predictability is the enemy of freedom.
And that susceptibility is magnified by the collapse of local and regional journalism in the U.S.
It structurally mirrors the abstraction we saw in Russia. When local, factual reporters disappear, the people covering the school board, the local courts news stops being about verifiable events that people see and care about.
It becomes abstract, national, distant entertainment.
And that makes the population highly susceptible to foreign-generated political fiction. It directs distrust outward, away from real local problems.
Which leads us right to election interference and targeted outrage, specifically in the 2016 U.S. election.
The Russian cyber war against the U.S. was part of that larger strategic policy against the West. It was designed to exploit weaknesses that were already there in American society.
The propaganda wasn't random. It was tailored based on what they learned about American susceptibilities online.
Precisely. They used propaganda about racism, anti-Muslim sentiment, gun rights in key swing states like Michigan and Wisconsin, They even targeted likely Trump voters with pro-Clinton messages on fake American Muslim sites just to generate and weaponize outrage.
And the ultimate goal is the weakening of institutions through cynicism.
If citizens believe all leaders and all media lie, the core tenet of P of E, then they dismiss Western models like the rule of law and democratic succession for themselves. They lose faith in the system.
In the U.S., the structural weakness of the Electoral College was exploited as a system ripe for this kind of cynicism.
By attacking the foundation of the democratic process, Russia gained power not by growing stronger, but by convincing Americans that their system was as flawed and unfair as Russia's. It's strategic relativism, bringing your rival down to your level of dysfunction.
But it's so crucial to stress that this vulnerability is rooted in a domestic problem that the politics of inevitability created. And that is the weakening of institutions through domestic oligarchy.
Yes, this is the structural climax of Snyder's argument for the U.S. He argues that American PIVI paved the way for eternity by generating and legitimizing vast economic inequality.
We saw it with deregulation. By 2012, American inequality levels were approaching Russian standards. The top 0.01% of families were 11,120 times richer than the average family.
And since 1980, the bottom 90% of the population has gained essentially nothing in wealth or income.
And that crushing inequality means the loss of future expectations for the majority. The fading American dream. When the future no longer promises prosperity, the idea of linear progress dies.
And when social advance stops, when life is demonstrably shorter and the future is troubled, that's when the politics of eternity beckons, with its simple myths of innocence and eternal enemies.
Snyder draws a powerful statistical link between the collapse of public health, the rise of deaths of despair,
Suicide, opioid overdose, alcoholism,
and the voting gains for eternity politicians.
This is where the abstract philosophy hits the pavement. In counties that were ground zero for the opioid epidemic, like Scioto County, Ohio, Trump saw spectacular gains over the previous Republican candidate in 2012.
The U.S., lacking a functional public health system, had essentially declared an opium war on itself, making a normal, forward-looking life impossible for millions.
And that despair creates the perfect psychological foundation for the eternity narrative. If your life is getting shorter and the future holds nothing, you are very receptive to the message that the fault lies not in the economic system, but in some nebulous cultural enemy.
And domestically, this relies on political fiction from within, leaders promoting internal myths.
Like questioning the wisdom of fighting the Civil War, or Trump's America First isolationism, which directly references the disastrous policies of the 1930s.
By doing this, American politics is recast as an eternal racial or cultural struggle against fictional enemies.
It converts the real, material problem of economic disparity into an endless, emotionally charged cultural conflict. And that prevents the necessary but difficult work of institutional reform.
We've covered a massive amount of detail, from Illian's philosophy to the opioid crisis in Ohio. Let's try to synthesize this by connecting it back to some broader themes about how power operates.
The first overarching theme is that power hides in the natural. The politics of inevitability was so effective and so dangerous because it disguised power.
If the good future is automatic, we stop asking what actually sustains a good political order. We stop holding leaders accountable.
And the collapse of that inevitability, as painful as it is, forces us to see that the system isn't automatic or eternal, it's historically contingent. You suddenly get a chance to see the levers of power.
The second major connection is the core strategy used by all these actors, converting economic inequality into cultural conflict.
It's the playbook of the oligarchy, whether it's in Moscow or emerging in the U.S. You use cultural anxiety, sexuality, race, immigration as raw material to divert attention away from the consolidation of wealth at the top.
It's the ultimate sleight of hand.
And it makes the necessary institutional reforms, like improving the rule of law or providing healthcare, politically impossible because the entire public debate is focused on manufactured moral panics.
And finally, the book emphasizes the profound risk of abandoning factual history. Snyder is a historian, and for him, the integrity of history is directly linked to the health of a democracy.
History as a discipline, he says, began as a confrontation with war propaganda, all the way back with Thucydides. Factual history sees the past as interpretable material with limits, with evidence. It's the only escape from the false choices of inevitability where the future is fixed and eternity, where the past is fixed.
And when factual history is abandoned for manufactured myth like the Smolensk conspiracy replacing verifiable Polish history, it enables authoritarian control.
Because leaders gain the power to redefine the past and the enemy to suit their present needs.
So what does the road to unfreedom help us see differently in our current moment?
It forces us to step away from the comfortable myths of either automatic progress or inescapable doom. It defines inevitability and eternity not as these external cosmic forces, but as ideas. Ideas that we choose to embrace and deploy within history itself.
And the central task it poses is this. If we want to have a democratic future, we have to win back the present for historical time.
Which means confronting our own specific problems, most critically, this vast and widening economic inequality, to restore a possibility of social advance, and with it, a shared sense of the future.
The book demands that we consider some really fundamental questions, the most challenging one being, can citizens truly maintain freedom when they lose the ability to distinguish between what is factually true and what they simply want to hear?
When the market for outrage becomes more rewarding than the search for facts, the road to unfreedom is already paved.
And to break that spell of eternity, we have to abandon the idea of national exceptionalism.
Whether it's American or European exceptionalism.
We have to see ourselves in history alongside others.
Recognizing that the problems of kleptocracy, inequality, and the collapse of factuality are shared, systemic tendencies that require constant vigilance and hard, necessary work to solve.
A sobering, detailed, and I think absolutely essential examination of the current moment and how we got here.
Indeed, a necessary framework for surviving this period of crisis and perception.
This deep dive was based entirely on the book The Road to Unfreedom: Russia, Europe, America by Timothy Snyder. We strongly encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author, or borrow it from your local library. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.